In the late 90s, everything was going gung-ho. The NASDAQ was up over 5,000 right before it crashed in early 2000. Dot-coms were being flipped and sold at incredible prices. There was a lot of money just floating around, and in our church body too. There wasn't a sense that it was ever going to stop. And so we decided that in that exuberance of the late 1990s, we decided that this would be a great project.
I note that we began in spring of 1997, and I gather from the report that's in the same file in my computer, concluded our work at the end of that summer, end of August 97. And as a subcommittee, we considered, no surprise, architecture, and that was a subcommittee of the overall new chapel committee.
So in the late 90s, it was probably about 97 or 98 that someone at the Synod headquarters came up with the idea of these projects for the 150th anniversary of the WELS.
An offering, a special chapel offering, was being gathered, and the hope was that construction could begin promptly on or shortly after that celebration of the sesquicentennial, or maybe even before. Again, the details are blurry. That didn't come to pass. As I recall, there were parameters regarding the funding of that chapel, and therefore the target couldn't be met unless those parameters were met, and I believe it was that all the funds had to be on hand before ground could be broken. Various things in the economy, of course, the size of the gift gathered, even things as interesting as the price of steel in China, caused the cost of the projected chapel to stay ahead of that gift, which continued to grow from things that people gave, but also even just from the basic interest of thoughtful storage of the money that had been gathered.
There were plans drawn up for that. There was probably about $700,000 spent on architectural drawings. And the firm that they used was from the Twin Cities. And the design really came out like what you would call a Norwegian stavkirke, with a tall center spire and arching ceilings. Well, I think the estimated price tag on that was about $14 million. And so it kind of just skidded to a halt, and then we didn't know what to do. Then, of course, there was considerable debate about what do you do with the money that God's people in good faith had given for the project. What do we do with it? Do we return it? Do we encourage them to divert it to a mission field? Or, what do you do?
As to whether our work as a committee, and I'm thinking just of this architecture subcommittee, had an impact, I don't know. I look over the committee that was formed in, I suppose, 97. And by that I mean the committee that gathered as the chapel committee, each of these subcommittee chairs under President Olson's leadership in a larger committee. Some of the same names are there that served ultimately for the chapel that was built here. But I don't know. The recollections I have are fading. And I do recall in skimming through that report that there are aspects of things we talk about in there that are not part of this chapel. Nevertheless, one would hope that in a certain sense we at least did spade work, stirred the pot, tried to look at this from lots of perspectives. And if some of those things paid off for the work of the committee that actually did finally bring to construction with the suggestions of architects and so on, then we did our job. But it turned out in that case then not to be what at the time we thought we were shooting for.
I was a chairman of the chapel building committee. And that committee, that really started in our worship committee. The worship committee at one point in time was wondering where the chapel project was going to go. So are we going to actually go ahead and build? Are we going to remain in our chapel auditorium? And so there was thinking on the committee, if we do not build, could we at least do some revamping in the chapel auditorium? Could we do it? Because some of the furnishings were looking pretty worn and beat up.
We were, try to say this nicely, we were not satisfied with the worship life in the auditorium. And we kind of said to ourselves, this is some of our committee members, Professor Moldenhauer and I and Professor Lenz kind of said, well, we got to do something. Either we're going to build a chapel or we're going to renovate the auditorium.
Because, of course, the auditorium, number of windows, I believe, the last I counted was 0, I believe. And then I think each time we've counted, we've found 0 windows in that facility, so.
I have no nostalgia at all for that auditorium, although I worshiped in there for nearly 15 years. It was a place that always felt borrowed, always felt, or often, frequently felt as though it had been, freshly, recently used for things other than worship, which of course is fine. 2 or 3 and many, many more were gathered there, and we were around the word.
And we actually brought in, President Olson was in on this, we actually brought in some WELS guy who was very creative, and we had a bit of a plan about we're gonna renovate this worship space, so we're gonna make it a worship space.
And so we approached the board, our board of control, with the idea, could we do some things in the auditorium? And they said no, which was fine. But then we said, well, if we don't do that, could we consider moving ahead with a chapel project? That was kind of the genesis of that. So the committee actually came out of that worship committee, and we had come up with a slate of names that we proposed to the board, and they approved that slate. So
after a period of time, and this is still before I got there, I believe the governing board agreed to appoint a building committee, and here's the amount of money that had come out of the synod offering, and it was the 7.2 or 7.5, and that's the amount of money. What can you do for that? So they authorized this building project. When they went back and took a look at that other original plan, they said, there's no way we're going to be able to cut this down and make this happen for that amount of money.
Our chapel building committee was at first named something like the chapel feasibility committee, which had the basic question with the money that has been given, which I think was about $8 million, somewhere between 7 and 8. Could we still build the chapel we wanted that would serve the campus's needs and not just be a real bare bones, low budget thing? And so that's where so when we interviewed architects, we gave them that price ceiling, whatever it was, and then they had to submit rough designs of within that budget for us. And then at the end of that process, it was determined, yes, we could build a chapel that would serve well for that money.
The first chapel plan had some great designs, but at the same time, it also incorporated some good things for the college, some offices, some links, and it got to be a very large project. And then when the synod offering really didn't bring in the type of money, not just for that project, but throughout, it became very difficult to consider how we're going to build something for that price. And if I remember right, I believe it was $15 million was the price tag on that.
We started with theology, our understanding of what worship is. And the driving part of that was, if worship is proclamation of Christ, if that is what worship is, both by pastor and by congregation and by musicians who either lead or proclaim themselves, if that's the case, what will the building look like? How will the building accommodate that kind of proclamation? So that led to a lot of things, like What's the role of acoustics in that? Who do you hear in the building as you are participating and proclaiming? Who do you hear? How do you hear them? That part. Visually, who do you see? Do you see only a leader? Do you see musicians? Do you see each other? You know, visually, what's it like? And what's the focal point in the building itself if the building is to be a place for proclamation? And in the design, that actually played out in what will the building say? What will it proclaim? When a visitor or a member walks in, what's first thing that they encounter? And then our second step was to take our concepts for how the building's going to carry out the theology we have in mind. Our concepts like a baptismal font at the front, at the door, strong emphasis on Christ on the chancel area, a place for musicians on the same level of seating for 1,000, all of those concepts, as well as on the exterior, we said to architects, we want this to look like it belongs here. Like it's not just plopped on the campus, but that it belongs here, maybe even that it's been here a while, that it has a sense of belonging. So we went to that phase, that concept phase, and put it down into several short statements that we sent to architects.
We did something a little unusual, and that was had a competition among 5 architectural firms after we had looked at a number of other firms. I think it was a dozen or 15 different firms that we looked at, and then invited 5 of those to submit a proposal to us. And we gave them certain parameters, the seating capacity, the idea that it would have a substantial pipe organ, a large gathering space, the position of the font, the centrality of Christ and Word and Sacraments as being a guiding theme, things like that.
At their own expense, 5 architectural firms drew up a schematic or a basic concept design for the chapel, all supposedly using this scorecard, this list. And it also included it can't exceed X dollars, which was, I guess, $7.5 million, the amount of money that had been given. One firm from the cities, one firm, I believe, from Texas, 2 firms from Wisconsin, forgot where the other one was from. And so that's kind of where it was when I got there. Had opportunity, put all the designs on a table, let the student bodies kind of walk through the boardroom and see the different designs and kind of react to it. Try to give them a little bit of sense of the initial stages of a building project and what's that look like.
And then those 5 firms, we interviewed them all, I think, in one night. It was a real marathon. We were all pretty blurry-eyed by the end.
And then the committee began by winnowing out several of the firms that didn't pay attention to the scorecard, whether cost or theological presuppositions or just what they wanted. And I think ended up interviewing 2, I believe.
And we thought that was a really helpful project, part of the process, because the normal process is to interview an architect, but when they actually had to bring something to carry out your concept, you got a different picture of them, rather than looking at a design they did for somebody else. How are they going to deal with our concept and that's where things separated out pretty quickly.
We wanted architects that had experience building a church. Unfortunately, the architectural firm that we worked with the first time around did not have any experience building a church. They had never built one. And so we did allow them to, again, present a project idea for the second go-around. They were one of the 5, but it was just clear to us that you need to work with somebody who's done it before. Without that, there's just really is not a good feel for what a church should be, what a church should look like, and there's more of we felt an emphasis on the exterior, the statement that the building was making instead of the day-to-day message that the building presents to the people who are worshiping in it.
And as a courtesy, we did allow the company that did the original design of 2000 to come up with another design. Now, not surprisingly, I kind of found it interesting, but it was really, really, really different. It kind of went out. It was more like a square building, and the ceiling had all sorts of curved wood, and the walls had curved wood, and it was basically a box, but it was built out over the pond and seemed to be floating on the water, and it was kind of cool, but there was no way we were going to go with that.
And one of the companies came in with something that was, again, they didn't listen to the instructions because they came in with something radically different from anything on campus, and indicated that at some point every campus has to go in a bold new direction.
There was also a very good plan that came out from another group, and it was interesting because they actually, one of the guys was a former ELCA pastor, Lutheran. So he really had a good feel for Lutheran theology, and the problem with their plan is it was way over budget. It was like $2 to $3 million more than what we actually told them we had.
One or two of them, I believe, didn't even get under the budget figure. Like, they basically said, no, we couldn't do this. Here's what we really think we should do, but this is going to be another several $1 million. And so in a way they were automatically disqualified.
And I understand this too from the vantage point of these architects. Some of them, this is a lot of time on their part to come up with a plan that meets our criteria before they're getting paid. So I felt like some of the architects, it was easier to say no, because they just did not think clearly about what we were trying to do.
Two of the firms definitely came to the top. There was no question about that. And then we talked about those two, and finally decided to go with Plunkett Rasich. I think they did everything we asked them to do in the proposal, in a creative way, in a way that seemed to fit the campus, seemed to fit our goals. They just seemed to be the right group, and I think the excitement of the lead architect in the group, John Holtz, was just totally apparent. And I remember him walking on campus the first day he was here before we ever even did the interviews, and he just was excited about the whole thing. So for me, that was a big thing.
So we prepared, did a whole lot of research on the WELS church, a whole lot of research on Martin Luther College, and the city of New Ulm. Those three were sort of the three pillars of how I was going to really gain an understanding of their project. Did that. They already had a floor plan and a location on their campus that they liked. We looked at it, we sort of vetted it, made sure, yeah, this is right, this feels right, this is the right place for this project. And we took their floor plan, we understood their program, they gave us a program as well, and then we essentially crafted a design for the interview that was good enough to get us to win. And a lot of that initial design came forward in what you see today. So my role from that point remained as the lead designer on the project, the senior project designer whose job it is to do a whole lot of listening and understanding what their needs are, how the building, the church, the chapel I should say, really needed to become the heart of campus. It was a campus that worshiped in an auditorium, and there was no big chapel, no heart of their campus. There was in spirit, but no architectural edifice that described that. So that was the challenge, and that's what we were able to come up with, and I had to lead that effort from massing, materiality, nestling in with their existing campus, and making it be the most important building there.
One of the reasons we went with PRA was he seemed to understand our concepts, like a theological concept. We want this to be in focus, we want that to be in focus, and he seemed to grasp that right away. Some other architects, we looked at their design and we said, I'm not sure they really understand what we were saying. But John Holtz he must have done enough, work with churches and that type of design. It was like immediately he knew what we were talking about. So we felt comfortable that when we said something to him, he would understand what we were saying. So it was a good fit, I think, John Holtz and the committee.
John is a good listener. He's a creative guy, and we really are thankful for the creativity that he brought to this, but he listened. And he was able to hear what we were saying and then even hear what we were trying to say and then make it into reality. So we were very often quite pleased with what John would come up with when we were talking about, the front of the church, and where's the triptych going to go, and how's the altar going to go, and how many steps are we going to need, and all those things. He was able to translate quite effectively.
PRA, I just call them PRA all the time. They did a good job on the design and incorporating the main, I'll say, emphasis for the building, which was to have a means of grace focus, reflective of Lutheran worship, at the same time a sense of community, and also worked with, part of the scorecard had audio, that's not a good word, acoustical elements for the use of the chapel. And so they did a good job listening and incorporating into their design some of those main emphases.
They seemed to understand that what we wanted done, number one. Certainly what we got from them as a preliminary, was not what we got at the end. It was a lot of tweaking that went along the way. But for one thing, we liked what we saw. They seemed to be very flexible and easy for us to work with. We felt really comfortable with lead architect, especially John Holtz. Felt like he really understood what we were coming from and was trying his very best to meet our expectations within the budget.
The biggest difficulty, of course, was staying within a budget. And that was a very definite thing that the committee took very seriously. We had a set number of dollars to work with. If we added something for $100, we had to take $100 out. If we added something for $10,000, we had to take $10,000 out. So that was a challenge, and I suppose you could call it a difficulty, but it was a challenge, especially when in our planning we thought we were within budget all the way. When finally the project costs got let out for bids, it was over budget. So that meant going back and looking at how do we get back into budgets. That was probably the biggest challenge along the way.
A lot of the areas where the budget was difficult and we had to make very, very important cuts, I learned that this group was not going to cut the beauty and the quality of the space. They cut out square footage where they needed to before they would compromise the design integrity, which means a lot as an architect that they care enough about the experience in that space. So that was something I learned from them that I don't always learn on with other clients and other projects.
We wanted a chapel that was kind of fan-shaped, because there's beautiful symbolism in God's people gathering around the Word. You have that picture in Revelation 7, where they're all gathered on the mountain of the Lord, which is kind of the ultimate fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. This idea that God's people gather around the Word.
When we received the interview or the competition papers, if you will, the request for proposal, they had identified this shape. There's a history to this project. It had been designed and redesigned a couple times, but I believe they had been really keen on this octagon form, which is a great religious form.
It's basically an octagon in the sanctuary itself. And that's symbolic, of course, of resurrection, of renewal, the 8th day of creation. That was one of our specifics in design.
If we go back to early Byzantine architecture, right at the beginning of what we call the Byzantine period, we see the prominence of this design of the octagon. Now, the octagon, the earliest known example of the octagon as a worship facility has been excavated at Capernaum, right on top of the house, well, they call it St. Peter's house. And there has to be something to that because this is a very old church. And so the tradition was probably pretty strong. But interestingly enough, it's an octagon shape. Now, we tried to pick that up in this design in several ways. The most obvious is the font. But essentially, the interior space of the building is an octagon shape. Now, what's the symbolism with the octagon? Well, people put out a bunch of ideas, but this really is the heart of it. If you count in Hebrew, they count inclusively. So, Sabbath to Sabbath is not 7 days, it's 8 days. And that number 8 comes to represent the eternal Sabbath, going from Sabbath to Sabbath, as Isaiah says towards the end of his book. In the book of Hebrews, of course, they don't use the term the 8th day or the eternal Sabbath. They call it today. Today we enter his rest, right? And that's really the symbolism behind the 8. Okay? So we tried to pick that up on the interior space, and then the narthex here is basically a rectangle that was attached onto it. The original design, though, did call for an octagon to connect right there. And that was going to be office space. That was going to be Pastor Boder's office. And then on this side, you see now it comes like this, but originally those were triangular rooms that were cut out as a cost-saving measure.
As they laid out the octagon, I think on a couple of the sides, there was going to be room for what would have been multi-purpose rooms. That would have been an extra classroom, which could potentially be very useful. But then also maybe with sliding glass doors for just increased capacity for concerts and things. And as dollar figures were crunched, we decided that that's something that could go, that we'd get along without that.
But the octagon is also a great form just in terms of focusing people toward a common unity, toward a whether it's the altar platform or the worship that's happening in the space, really create a group setting. And what they had was, it was an octagon, but it was stretched out in one direction, as you've seen, and really had no qualms at all about working with that form. Again, it made my job easier that they had already arrived at something. If they arrived at something that was maybe not a successful form, either functionally or visually, we would, we would have said so. But it was a beautiful form to work with.
We visited a number of places, either as a full group or individually. Many of us went to a lot of different places to find out what's going on in church architecture these days, and pick up ideas from all of those places. Sometimes things that said, this is definitely not what we're going to do, and other places where this is really, really workable idea.
Well, we looked at, hundreds of pictures of different churches, and we looked at hundreds of pictures of baptismal fonts, and we looked at, hundreds of different samples of this, that, and the other thing along the way. We visited a number of churches that were PRA people or churches that had this kind of same design coming out, and I don't know, a couple months of just thinking.
We met rather regularly for a while, weekly, and a little later on, not quite as often. But we did make all the choices together. The design, we discussed design and issues we had.
Some very long meetings. I believe some were 10, 11, and 12 hours long. And yet it wasn't as though we were just meandering or going in circles or having pointless discussions. We were always moving forward. For a project that large, it took a lot of time. But our chairman, as I said, didn't waste our time. He kept us on task and kept pointing us toward the various things we had to get done.
I think one of the main objectives one day, a whole trip to New Ulm, which takes about 7 hours of driving, is to agree upon the brick. And we had several brick samples, I think mostly from Sioux City in Iowa, and fairly close to that neck of the woods. So we would walk around all the campus buildings with all of these samples. Some are quite heavy, putting them up against this building, putting them up against that building, and arriving at the design or the manufacture and the pattern, the blend of the brick.
The seating in the chapel, the color of the cloth on the seating, it was just an interesting meeting.
Which reminds me of the miracle of the fabric swatches, if you'd like to know about that. Miracle, okay, that's too strong of a word, but when it came time to pick the fabric for all the chairs, after we picked the chairs, we had, several large, heavy books of those sample swatch books.
And we were, we're sitting there making these, looking at the different fabrics, and we're we looked around at each other. We're in the basement of the library, in that library conference room.
And I think it was pretty well agreed. That'd be generally in the green family, but then there's still, if not hundreds, dozens of greens to choose from.
6 men looking at cloth colors, and we have, I don't know, maybe a dozen or 15 in front of us.
And we men on the committee went through, how about these 6? Yes, well, the 6 best. Well, what about these 2? I think these are the 2 best. Well, what about between these 2? We think that one. Yeah, we could agree. That would be a really good one.
And then we look around the room and we say, we're all men. What are the women going to think?
So we actually brought down all the ladies in the library who were there.
And we laid out all the same samples we had, exactly the same ones, and said, out of these, which one would you pick?
Pick maybe a half dozen, pretty similar to the ones about the same batch we had. No secret signals or advice from us. Then narrowed it down to 2, which happened to be the same 2 we had narrowed it down to. Now at this point, you could have cut the tension in the room with the proverbial knife, because they have come down to the very same 2 finalists the men did. And as everyone held their breath and waited, they at last pointed to,
well, the women picked.
It's the same color that we had chosen.
the very one the men had picked.
We said, that's it, no question. No question. It's got to be the right one.
So we felt, all right, good, we're okay.
And that, my friend, is the miracle of the fabric swatches.
The name of the chapel, that was a huge item. The committee, our dream was, this was going to be Christ Chapel. Well, the chapel over in Gustavus Adolphus, 30 miles from here, St. Peter, the name of that chapel is Christ Chapel. So we felt, no, we just cannot name this chapel by that same name. It'll just look like we're copying. So then we did actually a kind of a poll of students and faculty. What names would you suggest? And then we kind of gathered a group of names. None of those names was the name we have, Chapel of the Christ.
I think the strongest competition, strongest finalists, there was a fair amount of redemption and redeemer, but I think the second most popular would have dwelt with the shepherd or good shepherd theme. And that certainly had its strengths because of Jesus. They were training teachers and pastors and staff ministers, and the word pastor going back to shepherd, and Jesus being the master teacher. So that certainly had its merits. Even there was some thought of the great shepherd, because there's a lot of good shepherds around, but that great shepherd of the sheep is a biblical reference too.
There were things like Good Shepherd Chapel, other names for Jesus, which all are fine, but none of them seemed to. This was one where the committee did not come to consensus. It was always, it's okay, but it's not quite right.
But we didn't go to that. We kept getting back to the simplicity of Christ. And Christ Chapel is simpler than Chapel of the Christ.
And it was really President Zarling who came up with this current name. We were, again, chewing this over, and I don't know which meeting on the name. And he finally said, well, what about naming it Chapel of the Christ to get away from duplicating St. Peter? And that flew immediately.
But then when we looked at the Christ, I forgot the precise number, but certainly dozens of times that phrase is used in the New Testament, the Christ, the Christ. Maybe more than we realize, and then we thought that created something of a teachable moment using that name, which is used so frequently.
And the committee itself was, the committee was a real blessing. It was one of those committees where we all felt free to express our opinions, but then we also were able to always come to consensus pretty easily. And yeah, not everybody got his way, but everybody seemed to be ready to move forward. It was just a great blessing. I mean, one for which we needed to step back and say, well, thank you, Lord, for providing this group to deal this way with this project. It was really a delightful project.
I think of the many committees I've been involved in over the years, this one had a spirit and a sense of the project that was very unified right from the beginning. And we rarely had I don't know that we ever had a major disagreement. We all seemed to be thinking the same way, and yet not without our eyes open and our ears open to other ideas and all of that. But the viewpoint and the focus was always the same, and I think that made it a real joy to be a part of.
There are certain rules architecturally about a worship space and how the structure works with it. The two can't be designed separately. And a lot of what they were giving us, their program, the location of the building, the acoustic importance, how they're going to worship and use this space, how many areas of seating they're looking for, and the different other aspects. And then you combine that with my knowledge of working on this building type, this wonderful building type, and combining the structure and the seating and making an emphatic form. They actually dovetailed rather well, and showing the Martin Luther College Building Committee the design from the exterior went very well. The interior design, we did go through the structure was not working out pleasingly.
He originally had the beams running this way. They ran from the front to the back this way. And actually there was a double set of beams on each side going from one end of the building to the other. And we looked at that, and that just did not strike us visually as very pleasing. It looked very boxy. And then we said to him, we're just not unsure about this.
And it was a head scratcher. There was some long nights, overnights on my part here at the office trying to figure out how to make this structure look beautiful, and finally did arrive at it, presented it to them again. Good thing about the process, they were always very positive about it, and yet definitely let me know and let us know, look, this structure is kind of weird. Can you work on it? And we finally got it right, and it's that crossing that you see today that still allows for the clear story windows above. Initially, it just wasn't happening, but it did come together.
The sung word about Christ is especially well suited. We erred on the side of music and the sung word resonating, reverberating well in this space.
At least the musicians on the committee from day one had said, well, we want the space to be acoustically live. And perhaps some of the non-musicians on the committee were wondering what we were talking about initially, but we were talking about reverb time and having live sound in the building. And the musicians on the committee had said, we know what we want. We would like 3 seconds of reverb time when the building's full. That's the goal. So we checked that out with acoustical engineers to see if that's possible. Yes, it's possible. How do you do that with hard surfaces? And in this building, the most surface areas, of course, are the walls and the ceiling. And in the construction, that meant like double drywall in the entire building so that the surface is hard and sends back waves of sound and doesn't flex.
It must be acoustically exquisite. It must be perfect. That was the directive. You can be less than perfect elsewhere, and I hope we weren't, but acoustically the building had to perform very well. After all, it's a $1 million organ, pipe organ that Martin Luther College was going to be installing by Shantz Organ Company in Ohio. Beautiful organ, a great company. This is a vessel, in a way, for that organ to perform well, so that liturgy of music and the word could really sing in that space.
Even the workmen that just set up the organ had nothing to do with its tonal design or anything else. They said this was the only project they could ever remember where anytime there was a change in the building, the committee would contact the organ company to see if it was okay. so that really says that how music was in the space was crucial, and certainly in the committee's overall plan and design, we wanted it to be a space where the music of the church could really function exemplary.
We're happy that it turned out just about where we wanted it. When the building's full, we're not quite at 3 seconds. We're maybe at 2.5, 2.4, somewhere around there. Very close, very close. And for music in the building, this is actually something very new on the campus. It's the first building or space that's actually friendly to music. It's friendly. Music travels through the building, and there's reverb, there's presence in the building, and so we see it as just being very friendly to that. It's very easy to be a musician in the building. It's just very easy.
This chapel, the architects came up with the design that there would be an access that was a bit longer. Music works best in a rectangular shape, not a bowl. And so they made this access, the the east-west access, longer, and that would, of course, then we have the music down on that end, and it would be coming down the long access. That was one of the things that was very appealing.
So the building had to be acoustically great, so it sings in the long direction. The choir sings from, I guess when you walk in from the left into the long direction of the space. But also, the other side of acoustics is everything else has to be quiet. The mechanical system has to be quiet. We went through many trials to make sure that Martin Luther College was satisfied with the decibel level of the mechanical system. And we didn't always get it right. We had to go through some effort to make it perfect. And it's a great space now.
And John Holtz was very good again with the design. And so he worked with our acoustical engineer, Scott Riddell, and they came up with a design which has a lot of height, but does not trap sound anywhere.
We have worked with Scott before, so the relationship was already in place. They what they want to see is that model right away, very early in their effort, so that they can begin testing their acoustic model. So began the design, had the height of the space somewhat figured out, shared it with them, talked about what I wanted to do on the ceiling, and talked about how these beams were going to pass overhead. And it was very important for them that there was a space between the high beam and the ceiling so that that air, that sound could transfer through and not hit up against something. So that was critical, that they're involved early. So it was a very good collaborative relationship, as it has been with them.
So the beams do not go up to the ceiling. There's space above them so that sound can travel across the beam over the top and land over on the other side. And on the floor level, the beams also do not go to the wall. There's space behind them and around them so that sound just does not get trapped. And while the sound isn't the same all the way in every place in the building, It is very good in the entire building. It does travel the way we had hoped it would travel.
There are two sound systems in the building, one that's geared more to speech and functions mostly from the altar platform area. And then there's a system that is designed specifically to help out music if and when needed. And the sense there is that you always feel like the music is coming from the music area. First of all, that's an important thing in audio systems these days. And it can be tweaked in such a way that you don't get the sense that it's amplifying the sound. And we don't need to use it for choirs, that kind of thing. It's maybe a soloist whose voice doesn't quite fill the volume of space.
Another design feature in the building is the place for the worshipers and then place for musicians. So we talked about that early on, and one of the early decisions was that we wanted the building to be large enough to hold the entire student body at one time. It had been a part of the campus worship life prior to this. Everybody on campus saw it as a strength, that everybody on campus gathers together for worship at the same time. It was a real strength for the campus. We wanted to retain it. So we asked that the chapel be able to hold 1,000 worshipers and to be able to do it on a single level without balconies.
Balconies have a certain cost efficiency because you get that many more seats in without necessarily that much bigger of a perimeter of your building. But then it also presents things like maybe additional cost of a elevator to access it. But on the WELS website, I think it's Pastor Gerlach has a discussion of the pros and cons of balconies. But one of the cons is the two congregation concept. It's like you've got the people downstairs, the people upstairs. It works against a little bit the idea of the communion of saints, the body gathered around together.
We talked about the space as a one-room design in church architecture where everybody's on the same plane, so to speak. And the choir, the organ, the instrumentalists are all symbolically a part of the congregation. And to carry that out, we decided not to go with balconies. It's all on one level. The placement to the side rather than in the back or the front says something about the musicians being a part of the congregation. I think those are some of the ways that happened.
Well, I like to think of the layout of the building as an encouragement in the fellowship of believers, because we get to see each other as we worship. We're all on the same level. That's not, we're not trying to make any, I don't think, grand statement there, but we're all a body of believers, and the focal point of our worship is Christ.
We were thinking that the body of Christ should be together on one floor,